Youth Drink Driving, a multidisciplinary approach. The following presentation is a group assessment for PSY4407, Psychology and Industry, Pathways to Employment. 3 students, Marguerite Bryan, Stacey Bryan and Rebecca Costa, have formed a multidisciplinary team to examine the issue of young people driving under the influence of alcohol in Australia. We have approached this issue from the perspectives of an organisational, clinical and forensic psychologist. I'll start with the organisational psychologist's perspective of this issue and provide evidence-based recommendations. I begin with a brief explanation of the problem and then consider the role of learning and development in preparing young drivers and recommend behavioural-based learning and assessment techniques as a preventative measure. Road traffic fatalities remain the largest cause of death for people aged between 15 and 24 in Australia. In its most comprehensive investigation into risk-taking among young people to date, the Australian Bureau of Statistics reported driving under the influence of alcohol as a high risk factor for young people. 15 years was the average age young men said they first consumed alcohol, with 17 being the average age for women. I'd like to consider this problem from the perspective of an organisational psychologist. Organisational psychologists have skills and knowledge in a variety of areas, including learning and development, change management, health, safety and employee well-being, to name a few. A number of these areas could play an important role in decreasing youth drink driving. However, for the purposes of this presentation, we will explore the role of learning and development. Professional learning and development in organisations includes the design, delivery and assessment of the competencies required to be successful at something. In the context of this presentation, I refer to learning and development and assessment methods of aspiring drivers undergoing the necessary training to obtain an unrestricted licence. Partnering with the leaders, designers, instructors and assessors of current driver training programs is important because the current program for young drivers could be enhanced to prevent drink driving behaviour. Development required to obtain a driver's licence includes an online knowledge test, 120 hours of driving practice, which is usually signed off by parents in a trust-based log system, and completion of a hazard perception test. The extent of lead indicators to prevent drink driving includes a handbook that explicitly states that learners and provisional drivers must have a blood alcohol concentration level of 0. The handbook also documents the negative consequences for driving under the influence of alcohol. If drivers are found to be drinking, there are a variety of evidence-based interventions to prevent repeat behaviour, including online and face-to-face cognitive behavioural learning and development tools. However, there are few evidence-based preventative interventions for youth drink driving. This is why a number of researchers are applying outcome expectancy theory to the design of behavioural-based learning and development interventions for employees and, in this case, young driving cohorts. Behavioural-based learning, development and assessment is gaining momentum in organisations for its success in reducing health and safety incidents and fatalities. We've also seen some initial success in reducing motorcycle fatalities. Behavioural-based training is an effective learning, development and assessment method because it accounts for the role of outcome expectancies as a cognitive factor in drink driving behaviour. Researchers have shown that positive expectancies in engaging with drinking and risky driving have a stronger association than with perceived positive outcomes, including social acceptance, relaxation and mood enhancement, than simply warning people of the potential negative outcomes of risky drink driving, including fines, loss of licence, injury and even potentially death. This explains why simply telling young drivers about the potential negative consequences of drink driving is not a compelling method to prevent them from engaging in it. A behavioural-based learning solution combines expectancy outcomes theory with findings about young people's proclivity towards increased risk-taking to improve the learning and development available to young drivers. It does this by specifically addressing learners' attitudes, motivations, and behaviours in much greater depth than the existing model. It includes a combination of highly interactive behavioural modelling practice in the training itself, dialogue, and ongoing assessment. Researchers have shown that more passive forms of learning, including the majority of learning completed by young drivers in the online and self-directed components, are significantly less effective in increasing safety behaviours. Reviewing the role of parents and integrating them into behavioural-based learning and development solutions is also important, especially when parents are the supervising drivers and or signing off on driving logs. The role of parental influence in safe driving behaviours is very well established, with young drivers most likely to adopt the driving practices modelled to them by primary caregivers. Parents are a vital part of safety outcomes and must play an active role in the learning development program. By approaching the problem of young drink driving from an organisational psychologist's perspective, I hope to have demonstrated how partnering with national and state authorities' leaders, designers and assessors can improve driver safety. Specifically modifying the existing learning and assessment for young people to include the techniques of behavioural-based training which addresses their motivation, attitudes and behaviours is more effective than the current combination of online and supervised driver practice. It is suggested that further research into the cost of making behavioural safety training mandatory for young drivers, integrated with strong involvement from their primary caretakers, is an important way to prevent young drink driving. References for this presentation are on the following slides.
We have considered an organisational psychologist's perspective of youth drink driving. We will now analyse the issue from a clinical psychologist's perspective. As previously stated, youth drink driving is a serious issue, and drivers aged between 16 and 24 represent a quarter of all deaths on Australian roads, but make up only 10 to 15% of the licensed driving population. Young drivers are also more likely than older drivers to appear in court charged with drink driving. Clinical psychologists work with individuals with moderate to severe psychological disorders. They conduct psychological assessments and aid in the treatment and prevention of mental illness throughout the lifespan. Clinical psychologists monitor outcomes and evaluate the appropriateness and effectiveness of psychological interventions for each client. From a clinical psychology perspective, mental health factors will be the focus in considering the etiology of youth drink driving. Research has shown mental health is linked to risky driving behaviours such as drink driving. The cognitive and behavioural changes occurring during adolescence are often associated with psychological distress such as depression and anxiety, and is likely to affect driving behaviours. We will first investigate depression, which is known to be an important contributing factor in youth drink driving. Almost 25% of adolescents experience depression, with 1 in 10 being depressed at any given time. A diagnosis of depression requires the presence of 5 or more depressive symptoms, which must include depressed mood or loss of pleasure and interest, persisting for at least 2 weeks. Further symptoms of depression as per the DSM-5 criteria include fatigue, loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness, and diminished ability to think or concentrate. Depressive symptoms that may or may not meet the criteria for clinical diagnoses have also been linked to driving after the consumption of alcohol. Research by Pogue and colleagues found that males who were depressed drove after consuming 3 or more drinks more often than those who were not depressed, and the probability of driving after drinking too much increased substantially for depressed individuals. Therefore, depression itself is an important predictor of the frequency of alcohol-impaired driving for males. For females, the onset of major depression also led to higher probabilities of drink driving. A study of females involved in alcohol-related vehicle accidents revealed that the rate of depression in the year leading up to the accident was higher compared to the rate of depression over a lifetime. This indicates that depression is an important mental health issue in relation to drink driving. A recent longitudinal analysis revealed that recovery from major depression led to a decreased probability of drink driving, and research by McDonald, Summers and Fargo revealed that depression was significantly associated with problem drinking and drinking and driving in late adolescence aged between 18 and 24. As problem drinking has been linked to depression and drink driving, alcohol use disorders appear to be another contributing factor to youth drink driving. Alcohol use disorder is defined as a problematic pattern of alcohol use which leads to significant impairment or distress. Alcohol is often consumed in large amounts or over a period longer than initially intended. Individuals diagnosed with alcohol use disorder or problem drinking may often recurrently consume alcohol despite being in situations where doing so is physically hazardous, such as operating a vehicle. Studies have shown patterns of risky driving behaviours were most pronounced in late adolescent males who reported more problem drinking. In addition, research on problem drinking and impulsivity indicated that the best predictor of drink driving behaviours in novice drivers was alcohol-related problems. Through systematic reviews, cognitive behavioural therapy has been evidenced as an effective treatment for depression and also alcohol use disorders. CBT is based on the principle that cognitions influence feelings and behaviours, and that subsequent behaviours and emotions can influence cognitions. During CBT, the clinician assists individuals in identifying problem thoughts, emotions, and behaviours. There are 2 aspects of CBT. Behaviour therapy is based on the idea that behaviour is learned and can be changed. Cognitive therapy is based on the premise that distressing emotions and maladaptive behaviours are the product of faulty patterns of thinking. Therefore, CBT aims to replace these dysfunctional thoughts with more positive and helpful cognitions. This leads to a reduction or elimination of problem thoughts, emotions, and behaviours. A systematic review of 18 studies on depression in adolescents has shown substantial evidence that cognitive behavioural therapy is an effective form of therapy for the treatment of depression in adolescents. Research has shown, with consistent 2-hour-long weekly CBT sessions over 10 weeks, CBT was an effective treatment in the reduction of depression. Both individual and group CBT were found to be effective. In regards to alcohol use disorder, a systematic review on randomized controlled trials for the treatment of adolescent substance use disorders has indicated that CBT is an effective therapy that can effectively treat the disorder. Group and individual CBT has been found to demonstrate significant reduction in adolescent substance use. Evidence for CBT in modifying risky driving behaviours has been demonstrated, as CBT has been successfully implemented to reduce aggressive driving behaviours. Equally important is the finding that a short intervention on the topic of impulsive behaviour while driving was conducted involving novice drivers. The intervention took the basic position of CBT and reiterated that human behaviour depends on the circumstances of how he or she thinks in these situations. Group activities involved learning how to detect feelings and thoughts and how to monitor and modify driving behaviours. 3 years post-intervention, the drivers who participated in the intervention were significantly less likely to partake in drink driving compared to the control group. At the time of licensing, the following interventions involving the integration of mental health screening has been proposed to reduce the incidence of youth drink driving. A short CBT-based intervention, no longer than 2 hours, may be beneficial for all learner drivers to attend prior to obtaining their learner's permit. Such an intervention may help learner drivers identify and alter dangerous driving behaviours, such as drink driving, before they even get behind the wheel. Further interventions are proposed for those applying for their provisional driver's licences. Due to the evidence that illustrates mental health as a prominent issue regarding drink driving behaviours in young drivers, it is proposed that individuals under the age of 25 applying for a provisional driver's licence undertake psychological assessments to screen for depression and problem drinking. These drivers who are applying for their provisional licences would complete the Beck Depression Inventory, 2nd edition, and the Alcohol Use Disorder Identification Test. Those scoring moderate or severe on either psychological assessment or both would be required to participate in individual CBT once a week for at least 10 weeks. Co-occurring substance use disorders and depression in young people are associated with poorer treatment outcomes. Therefore, those who are screened and have both high scores on depression and alcohol use disorders could be required to complete more CBT treatment over a longer period of time. As depression can be episodic and chronic, it is proposed young drivers should undertake psychological assessments once a year until they are 25 years old. Those who are chronically depressed, that is, scoring moderate or severe for 2 or more years, may benefit from long-term CBT for depression reduction. Studies have shown a decrease in drink driving behaviours in those who recovered from depression. A CBT-based intervention is likely to assist young drivers to gain a deeper understanding of their typical response style and coping strategies in order to decrease risky driving behaviours. Individual progress would be monitored by a clinician, and termination of the intervention would be granted when an individual is deemed as low risk for drink driving behaviour. For this multidisciplinary investigation of youth drink driving behaviour, the issue has been viewed from the perspective of the organisational and clinical psychologists. It will now be explored from the perspective of a forensic psychologist.
Youth drink driving from the forensic perspective. So, what is forensic psychology? Forensic psychology is a branch of psychology that specializes in issues that regard to legal proceedings. It could also include things such as assistance in court cases and assistance in correctional and mental health facilities. Forensic psychologists are often involved in forensic interviewing, collecting psychological evidence, assessment, intervention, and research. So, what does it have to do with risking driving in youth? Forensic psychologists will deal with a lot of youth cases in their career, and a lot of those cases would involve risky driving. Those cases could include violations of laws such as drinking under the influence and culpable driving causing death. Driving under the influence involves driving or attempting to drive a vehicle while under the influence of drugs or alcohol that they are incapable of effectively controlling the vehicle. According to Bates and colleagues, 21.2% of people aged 17 to 25 had driven under the influence of alcohol. Also, according to Bates and colleagues again, 17% of people aged 18 to 21 have driven under the influence of drugs. That shows a significant amount of youths that engage in this risky driving behavior. Forensic psychologists will often be involved in determining whether the offender has a drug or alcohol addiction and deciding whether the offender needs treatment for that addiction. Culpable driving causing death involves reckless or negligent driving that significantly caused the death of another person, which can be caused by drinking under the influence. According to the Sentencing Advisory Council, 34.6% of culpable driving offenders were aged 20 to 24, which is the highest among all other age groups. And again, according to the Sentencing Advisory Council, the 9.1% of culpable driving offenders were under the ages of 20. This shows that youth drivers do take the majority of culpable driving offences. So what can people in the forensic psychology field do to fix the problem? There is not a lot you can do after the offender that has been sentenced other than intervention. Those interventions could be education-based, which assume a lack of knowledge on the offender's part. It actually aims to attempt to educate the offender on how to separate episode drinking from driving to avoid any more incidents. There are also more counselling-based programs, but it's argued that a mix of both education-based and counselling-based programs are beneficial in an intervention. There are some more ways to prevent risky driving behaviour before it even happens. This can be done by using the media and school-based education programs to warn young people about the dangers of driving under the influence. There are several studies that measured the effects of school-based programs on drink driving. One of those being by Enzo, Papa, and Haru in 2011, they conducted a study where they assessed drunk driving in novice drivers after taking part in an intervention targeted at reducing drink driving. They assessed youths that were currently enrolled in driving school and integrated an intervention into one of their classes. The intervention was a 1.5-hour session including CBT, group discussion, self-reflection, and information about traffic accidents and the effect it could have on them and the people around them. After a 3-year follow-up, it was found that those who undertook the intervention had a significantly lower proportion of drink drivers compared to those who did not undertake the intervention, which shows that education-based programs do work in decreasing the amount of driving under the influence. Another school-based program was the one done by Griffin, Budvin, and Nichols in 2004, who conducted a study testing the effectiveness of a school-based drug prevention program and risky driving. The program lasted up to 1 day and included information about the risks and consequences of drug use. They concluded that those who undertook the program had significantly less drink driving offences than those in the control group. This is just another study that shows effectiveness of just drug prevention programs on its own, just in schools. Shoaib, Elliott, Raghunnathan, and Waller in 2001 conducted a study measuring the effectiveness of a high school alcohol misuse prevention program on youth driving. They had high school students undertake 5 sessions of the program, which aimed to increase awareness of the short-term effects of alcohol misuse and its risks, including drinking and driving, and social pressures. They were introduced to skills to help them deal with the social pressures relating to alcohol misuse. It was concluded that this program had a positive effect on the students' driving, compared to those who did not undertake the program. Yet another school-based program that showed positive effects in youth drink driving. A more general review of school-based programs was conducted by Eldon, Nichols, Schultz, Sleet, Barrios, and Compton in 2005. They collated studies that measured the effectiveness of school-based instructional programs in reducing drink driving. They ended up only reviewing 13 papers due to their strict guidelines, which is not really sufficient to conclude anything, although they did find that the studies did reduce drink driving in those who were exposed to a program, but they did need more studies to clarify the relationship between school-based programs and drink driving. This calls for more research into school-based programs as a whole. So even though more studies need to be conducted, there was a general positive trend of these school-based programs, but we can also improve youth drink driving through the media. In regards to media marketing campaigns, Perkins, Lincolnbach, Lewis, and Neighbours in 2010 evaluated the efficiency of a media marketing campaign aimed at reducing the prevalence of drinking and driving in young people in Montana in the US. The campaign was comprised of television ads, radio ads, printed ads, and even in-theatre ads. The campaign aimed to normalize the prevention of drink driving and to encourage residents to use other forms of transport if they are under the influence, including using a designated driver, a cab, or public transport. They assessed 4 samples over the span of 18 months and found that there was an increased use of designated drivers, reduced misperceptions about alcohol misuse, and decreased drink driving in general. This shows the widespread effectiveness of media marketing campaigns. A more recent study by Yadav and Kobayashi in 2015 researched the effects of a social media campaign on drink driving behavior. They reviewed 19 studies that aimed to reduce alcohol-related crashes between 2002 and 2013. They found that although these campaigns produced some positive effects, again, there was still more research needed on more current social media. In conclusion, there are a lot of ways to decrease risky drink driving in youth drivers, and this issue can be tackled in areas such as organizational psychology, clinical psychology, and forensic psychology, as shown in this presentation. These are my references. Thank you for listening.